When we think of famous people in Alaska, often the gold miner, the pioneer, the fierce, rugged individual comes to mind. The history of these people is well documented in the many books about Alaska. But the history of Alaska Natives is less well known. In this program, you are going to meet two Alaska Natives who didn't get much attention in the history books. They should have, because they played a significant role in the history of Alaska. Howard Rock and Chief Katlian lived in different centuries and in different regions of Alaska, but they both were leaders in defending their people's right to the land.
This tranquil port in southeast Alaska dates back thousands of years. But Sitka's long history is still fresh in the minds of people who live here. It would be hard to forget the past. The reminders are everywhere. Totem poles tell the story of the first people who settled here, the Tlingit Indians. But the skyline is punctuated by another symbol of the past. In the middle of Sitka, the steeple on the Russian Orthodox Church pierces the sky, recalling the arrival of the Russians at the turn of the 19th century. The Russians came here seeking a fortune in the fur trade, but first they would have to face this man in battle, Chief Katlian, a great Tlingit warrior. These waters have sustained the original people here, the Tlingit Indians, for 10,000 years. Among the Tlingit clans are the Kiksadis, who settled in Sitka. Traditionally, the Kiksadis survived by fishing these waters and hunting this land. But by the turn of the 19th century, great change was on the horizon. In 1799, the Russians arrived in Sitka. They came to hunt the sea otter and to sell its fur for a handsome profit in markets as far away as China. The Russians seized the opportunity for great wealth by establishing a permanent base for themselves just outside of present-day Sitka. They built a fort, but the land here did not belong to the Russians. It belonged to the Tlingit people.
From the Tlingit point of view, they were poachers and troublemakers.
Historian Glenn Barrett says as far as the Tlingits were concerned, the Russians were intruders.
And their relationship between the Russians and the Tlingit was very tense from the very beginning.
First, the Russians intruded on Tlingit land. Then they turned out to be bad trading partners. By 1802, the Tlingits had had enough. Led by the Kiksadi clan, they drove the Russians out by destroying their fort. A Russian who witnessed the destruction of the Russian fort in 1802 described it this way.
I saw many Kiksadi armed with guns and spears surrounding the barracks. I ran into the woods and hid myself in a hollow tree trunk. Two of the Kiksadi pursued but could not find me. After a while, I crawled out of my hiding place and saw that now the barracks and all the other small buildings belonging to the hunters were in flames. This barbarous bloodshed and fire continued. Пламя до вечера того дня. Напоследок еще пошел было я на то жалостное.
The Russians wrote down this testimony and many other accounts of the fire. Today, scholars and historians rely on these Russian documents to find out what happened in 1802. But this leaves us with a distorted view of history. After all, the Russians' version of the story was very different from the Kiksadis. Unlike the Russians, the Tlingit people did not have a written language. Traditionally, they remembered their history by passing it on by word of mouth, verbally, from generation to generation. This is called oral history. Because the Tlingit side of the story was not written down, we don't read much about it in the history books. Losing their fort to the Kiksadis was a major setback for the Russians, but that did not discourage the chief manager of the Russian colony, Alexander Baranov. He was determined to reestablish a post for the Russian-American company in Sitka.
They already had a post at Yakutat, and this post at Sitka was one that was very important to him as a base for further operations.
And this time, Baranov wanted more than just the pelts of sea otters. He also wanted revenge.
The company headed by Baranov, who was the chief manager on the coast, thought that it was their obligation in every sense to take revenge.
Meanwhile, Katlian was emerging as a leader of the Kiksadi clan. He foresaw that Baranov would return to Sitka, so Katlian began to prepare his people for another clash with the Russians.
No, he was an extraordinary person because he was the one who saw the danger of the change coming.
Evidently, he was a real strong leader. He was one of those individuals that automatically takes over in crisis situations.
Ellen Hope Hayes, also a Kiksadi, says that in Tlingit society, Katlian belonged to the nobility and was expected to become a leader. For Katlian and his people,
it was their honor and their duty to defend their land and themselves.
This was the site where Katlian would defend his people in an all-out battle with the Russians. Today, the battleground is a national park. Park ranger Gary Candelaria says the Kiksadis were ready when the Russians returned.
In 1804, when Baranov returned to the area, the Tlingit had expected them to come back. It wasn't a case of, we destroy one fort and that's the end of it. They had definitely laid plans in the event of a Russian return, and they'd constructed a fortified location to withdraw to.
The Kiksadis built their fort at a strategic spot near the mouth of the Indian River. As Katlian had expected, in 1804, the Russians returned. The Kiksadis and Russians negotiated, but without success. The Russians began firing on the Kiksadi fort, but they were not able to penetrate its walls because the Kiksadi had built the fort with huge timbers. Inside the fort, the Kiksadis readied themselves for battle. Katlian put on his war helmet, the head of a raven, and he armed himself with nothing more than a blacksmith's hammer. Meanwhile, Baranov, seeing that his firepower wasn't penetrating the fort, decided to go ashore with a landing party and confront the Kiksadis. Baranov was not expecting much resistance. According to oral history, as Katlian was going out from the fort, a cannonball grazed his head and he fell. The Russians were going to cut off his head. As soon as they were going to kill him, he jumped up and made the sound of a raven and started hitting them with a hammer. This startled the Aleut men, whom the Russians had ordered to fight in their front line of defense. The Aleuts scattered, and the Russians were met with a battery of Tlingit gunshot. The Russians retreated to their ships.
On a face-to-face level, the Tlingit and the Russians were equally matched. Weapon-wise, probably the Tlingit had a great deal more determination than the average Russian fur hunter. All he was fighting for was his pay. The Tlingit, of course, were fighting for home and family and tradition and honor.
Katlian's surprise strategy was a victory for the Kiksadis, or would have been, if it hadn't been for the 450-ton Russian frigate, the Neva. This Russian warship continued to pound the Kiksadi fort with cannon fire until finally the Kiksadis had little choice but to surrender or retreat. The Kiksadis decided it was better to retreat from their land than face harsh punishment and even slavery at the hands of the Russians. So on the 6th night of the battle, the Kiksadis quietly left their fort and fled the area on foot, carrying only a few belongings they could manage.
They couldn't take sacred objects with them. They had to take survival material. Sacred objects and the requiring and certification of sacred objects is clan history in the old tradition, in old custom. They had to leave a whole lot in order for them to survive as Tlingit people.
In winning the Battle of 1804, the Russians drove Katlian and his people off the land they had lived on for thousands of years, and Sitka became the capital of Russian America. But later, Katlian and his people did return to Sitka. More than 20 years after they had retreated, the Kiksadis came back and rebuilt their village just outside the Russians' new fort.
I think it took more guts to come back to Sitka than it did to fight the battle, because they moved back to Sitka and built that village right underneath the walls of the fort. Underneath the cannons of the fort, they rebuilt the village to assert their right to be there.
Ever since the Battle of 1804 in Sitka, it's been a continual struggle for the Tlinkits and other native groups to hold on to their land. Katlian fought his battle with a blacksmith's hammer, but now native people fight for their rights in courtrooms and in the Congress of the United States. Today, these are the battlegrounds where land claims are settled. Katlian was the last great warrior of his era, but he was the first of many to come in modern times.